Today is Friday, October 22nd, 2021, which means it's Derelict Friday. Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are ya? As I sit here in the dark pondering the inevitability of the semicolon and sipping a mug of Corpse Coffee's Bone Shaker, visit corpsecoffee.com and put the dead in your cup, it occurred to me that the Derelict Saga ends next week. As in, the final episode will hit the feed, and I'll be done putting out this particular podcast. Since December of last year, I've been dropping one of these puppies a week, and as usually happens when I come to the end of a podcast run, I'm not quite sure what to do with the podcast while I focus on getting the next book written. If you're subscribed to the Derelict feed, I'd like to urge you to subscribe to the shadowpublications.com feed so you get the latest content from me, which will no doubt include weekly reviews or essays and the occasional story from the MacLeod until Station 3 starts its run. Also, I have other books. The Black series, the acclaimed but rarely enjoyed Gare's Inferno, Children of Garaga, all sorts of stuff. So if you get wistful for new story content, there's always the past broadcasts, which you can find at shadowpublications.com. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 46, the penultimate episode of Derelict Trident and the Derelict Saga. Chapter 77. Kelly caught herself from falling and cursed. Her hips still bothered her even after nearly 2 weeks of constant nanny attention. In truth, that had helped considerably, but it still twinged, or, like it did now, gave her a healthy bolt of pain just to remind her of the damage it had taken. She hated her hip. She wanted to explain to the hip that its injuries were incurred while saving humanity, and therefore it should shut the fuck up and support her mass. Maybe she was losing her mind. Kelly had left the comm station, although she was still tethered via her collar. The station's printer had come online a few days ago, and already the crew of Trident wore the new comms collars that allowed them the same versatility of block tech, but shielded them from direct mental connections. It meant having to wear the void-blasted things and learning a new interface, but as changes went, it could have been worse. She found her balance, finally, and walked slowly down the corridor, limbering up. Her training jumpsuit, SFMC embroidered proudly on the back and front, just below the menacing black company familiar, was going to catch a lot of sweat and pain to boot. It was her first real workout since everything changed. It was going to hurt. She took a deep breath and started her jog. The trio had thoughtfully provided a running track that meandered through the wheel, putting its users close to the transaluminum viewports without pedestrians obscuring the view for others in the modules. A 4-meter-wide track she could run her squads through without having to worry about booking time in the training domes. That was another thing on her list. She had spent the past several days, when she wasn't in comms, in meetings with Trident's command crew, or with Dickerson, planning and designing new training routines to match their experiences on Mira. She knew Talby was already working up scenarios for future SV pilots as well. A former SFMC First Lieutenant and Corporal were working out the training regimens for troops that may or may not arrive. They were designing the future of warfare for humanity, and for once, it wasn't for killing other humans. They had a much more formidable foe to worry about. She fell into an easy gait, not pushing herself too much yet. The hip let her know it was there, but it mostly kept to itself. She knew that would change in a few minutes. Bastard thing. Her scalp tingled pleasantly as she picked up speed, the freshly shaved flesh sensitive to the movement of air. Chrome Dome would be nice while it lasted. She'd lose patience with the grooming practice eventually, though, and let it grow out into a flat top. For a while. Then she'd go back to shaving it. Dickerson claimed he didn't mind one way or the other, which was good, because she didn't give a shit what he thought. She smirked. That wasn't exactly true. They'd become lovers after a few days, although she still caught the hint of guilt in his eyes every now and then. He missed Carb, and she knew he always would. Truth be told, Callie missed her more than she'd ever let on. For all her faults, Carb had been an amazing Marine to the end. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. She was dead because of it, and Dickerson and Callie were both left to grieve. Callie wiped an errant tear from her eye and increased her pace. Her muscles warmed, a pleasant burn beginning in her calves. Too much rest.
Too much sitting around. Too much healing? The trio had access to some of the collective's technological toys, things human beings didn't currently have the science to explain, but the trio tossed around their function and areas of effect as if these new weapons were no more destructive than flechette rounds fired at a star. Dunn had assured her that over time, the trio would become more, well, human. They had 40-plus years of socialization to relearn. Perhaps. Although she hadn't been on the station long before the mission to Mira and hadn't interacted much with any of the trio, she noticed the difference in how Portunas interacted with them. Carinius seemed to already be falling back into some of its old habits, becoming more formal and stolid, while Portunas went the other direction of gregariousness. Janus? The SI had already all but disappeared into the background. Callie wondered if the trio had been uplifted like Black, but since they had no real personality to begin with, it would take them longer to evolve. Which brought up another question. How could humans ever be certain that the collective hadn't booby-trapped this new trio as they had Black? Could Black even be certain her own systems were clean? There would always be doubt. This young, immature trio had access to weapons humanity didn't understand, and they were little more than toddlers wielding massive amounts of power. Dunn was their erstwhile mentor, socializing them slowly and gently, while making the case for using ionized radiation clouds against possible human boarders. The trio had proudly announced the damage to the ships and Trident would be negligible, although human casualties, including those of Trident's crew, would certainly rise as high as 100%. Callie had almost sprayed her coffee across the holo display. Dunn had then explained why they wanted 0% crew casualties. Damage to the ships was completely acceptable, while human casualties were not. The trio had paused before asking if that meant sentient entities' existences were less important than humans'. Callie had held her breath, just like everyone else in the conference room, while Dunn turned that conundrum over in his mind. Finally, the commander had explained that the ultimate goal was for as little damage to any sentient entities as possible, including humans. That seemed to please the trio, but it left her feeling as though the concept of a shared common fucking sense was not something humans could take for granted when dealing with the trio. Humans could never take conversations with an SI lightly, or expect them to have the same goals. The collective had proved that humans no longer control their own destiny, but still somehow fit into the SI's plans. While the collective could, and already had to some extent, ditch humanity without a backward glance, the ones that stayed behind, or were forced to, she reminded herself, had to be treated like people, co-workers, albeit ones that required special supervision. In time, she mused, we might even become friends. Was that possible? She knew Dickerson and Black had begun conversing. The SI had nothing but questions for him about his life on Earth, things he did, lessons he learned, things he thought, mistakes he made. Whenever Dickerson talked about Black, Callie found herself feeling both jealous and uneasy. The first was ridiculous, she knew, but Black spoke more like a human being these days, and at times it was disconcerting. The unease was more about the intimacy the pair had reached with one another and the glint in Dickerson's eye. That glint was because he looked forward to his next conversation with Black, and maybe because he was teaching another sentient about being human. If Black were the only sentient Dickerson spoke with, she'd be very concerned. But Dickerson opened up to Callie whenever she prodded him a little, helped him with his grief over Carb, over everything. In some ways, they became lovers because of that absence, that tearing void that could devour both of them. Survivor's guilt. Callie ground her teeth and picked up the pace. Her knee joined the chorus of her hip, letting her know she was favoring one side. She slowed and focused on her body mechanics, ensuring her posture was correct. The habitat wheel wasn't in motion, but her mind seemed to think it was. Deep breath, focus, deep breath, focus. Her knee quieted, as did her hip. Callie increased her pace.
Do the same damn thing with your mind,
a voice said. Callie stumbled before she came to a halt, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She whirled around, but there was no one there. She tapped her collar. Portunas? Yes, Callie Mora? Is there someone in here with me? No, there are 22 sentients on the levels below and above you, but none on this level. She opened her mouth to ask if Fortuna's was certain, and then closed it. It was a stupid human question to ask, and she had to rid herself of having to do it. Now maybe she knew how Black felt when she had to keep asking questions she should already know the answer to. When was the last sentient on this level apart? Fortuna sounded amused when he broke in. The last sentient before you was Samuel Dickerson. That was 17 solar minutes ago. Oh, is something wrong? Fortuna's asked. She felt the blush and knew the entity was watching her, studying her, learning, which made it that much worse. Just thought I heard something, she said. She waited for Fortuna's to end the conversation or ask if there was anything else, but after a few beats, she realized he'd already disconnected. Kelly closed her eyes and let out a long exhale. Fucking voices. She slowly resumed her jog, allowing herself time to find her rhythm and for her body to do the same. A bead of sweat flowed down her face to her jumpsuit. She could feel its hot trail like a meteor across the Martian sky. Grinning, she quickened her pace, urging more of the cleansing sweat to pour forth. The voice had been right, of course. They always were, even if it took her days to realize it. She needed to spend less time thinking about her poisoned past, less time building from a damaged base. Rebuild the mental muscles. Rebuild her life, one step at a time. Were the voices her internalized subconscious speaking to her stubborn consciousness? Or were they some psychological disorder explained in great detail by people or sentients who'd never had it? Sometimes the voices had a color associated with them, a flavor. Maternal, paternal, friend. Fucking ghost. The ghosts, the best label she'd managed for them, were more intense, as if they were talking just behind you or beside you. Or maybe right in your fucking ear. This last one had been a ghost, and now she knew for certain that either Fortuna's was lying, or he couldn't see or hear what was going on around her. Meaning either the entire crew was in big trouble, or what? Or you're going insane, she panted. Shit, could anyone blame her? After Mira, after Trident, after watching her fellow Marines torn apart via holo recordings, wasn't sanity expected to be a casualty? Another question she hadn't bothered to ask anyone. When you think you're losing your mind, the last thing you want is for other people to know what you're thinking. Dickerson knew she'd been holding something back. She could see it in his eyes after they made love, when he stroked his hand across her scalp and tucked her into the crook of his good arm. She could see the unspoken question on his lips. What's wrong? If he asked her aloud, could she answer the question? She didn't think so. Maybe that's what was driving her mad. She sometimes dreamt that Gunny visited with her. He held her hand while he made her relive the terrible moments haunting her, and let her cry on his shoulder until she awakened to find tears on her pillow. She always felt better after those dreams. Maybe one day she'd no longer need to have them, and she'd be able to face the nightmares on her own. One day. They don't go away, the ghost said. She didn't stumble this time, didn't register surprise. Somehow she'd known it was going to talk again. The nightmares don't ever go away, the ghost said. But you can turn them into whatever you want. Control them. The image of Gunny, the person she once knew, flashed before her as if he were jogging backwards and keeping pace a few meters in front of her. Dream big, the ghost said, and disappeared. She stumbled, lost her footing, and crumpled against the transaluminum. Kalimora, are you in need of assistance? Fortuna's called out. Assistance? She started to laugh. After a few beats, the laughter turned into sobs. She covered her face with her hands, tears flowing between her fingers. Detonation, destruction, carb evaporating in an instant of light. Kelly wailed and rocked forward, back against the bulkhead and hunched over. Do you require assistance? Fortuna's asked again. No, Kelly managed through a breathy sob and screwed her fists into her eyes. I just needed a moment, Fortuna's offered. She dropped her hands to her knees and stared upward, as if the sentient entity were standing over her. Yes, she whispered. Take all the time you require, Fortuna said gently, and let me know if you need my assistance. Thank you, she said, and wiped away another tear. She giggled. Fortuna's had just basically told her, "I'm not going to ask again. Go be human." The giggle turned into laughter that slowly dissipated. She felt numb, as though her mind had been rebooted, and her nervous system were just now coming online. The deck felt cool beneath her fingers, and she smelled the scent of newly minted Atmos steel, the slightly sweet tang in the air that spoke of fresh filters and sanitary life support. A rush of air from an unseen vent washed over her, the sweat turning frigid against her skin. Kelly rose, her knee complaining again, but this time from an abrasion. Once she made sure she hadn't tweaked anything, she took up a fast walk and quickly found herself in a jog. Kelly growled as she turned her jog into a run. Tendrils of pain snaked up her calves and threaded into her lungs. Breathing became more difficult until she found a new rhythm, reteaching herself to breathe, to run, and remember she was alive and in love. Those two things would have to be enough for now. Chapter 78. Dickerson stared out of the observation window on the new habitation wheel. It had been nearly a month since the battle, and multiple mini-asteroid belts of debris still circled the station in strange eddies that he couldn't explain. It was as if micro-whirlpools of gravity danced invisibly through space, the bizarre but cyclical movement of the debris their only evidence. Leavings of the gravity weapons, or from the creatures? He didn't know. Once Trident was fully functioning, he imagined the automatons would start cleaning up the mess. He was glad he wouldn't have to do it. His prosthetic leg ached. Elliot had told him that was normal and he could expect it to get worse. A new and improved leg, however, was currently under construction, and like the new hangar bay modules, it would soon be ready. In a week or two, he and Elliot could ditch their temporary prosthetics and get back to the real deal. If they rehabbed properly, the replacements would function better than their original parts. Fortuna's had warned both Marines they would follow a strict regimen after the surgeries. In a strange way, Dickerson was looking forward to the pain of regenerating nerve endings, closing synaptic gaps, and the itch of new muscle and bone bonding together beneath a superstructure that moved as it wove the cloned limb to the wound. Maybe the SIs would offer Trident's Marines combat suits featuring built-in flesh regrowth. Wouldn't that be something? Unlikely, but possible. Far more likely, the SIs would just find a way to plant your consciousness into a non-carbon body, he thought. Dickerson shivered. It was bad enough to be suspected of no longer being fully human, but to actually be crammed into an artificial body or metallic chassis? The idea was abhorrent. No matter what the ungrateful assholes of Sol System said, he wasn't a collaborator. That's what the billions of humans on SolNet had termed those who had cooperated with the collective in overthrowing humankind. Anyone that had been aboard Trident Station bore suspicion, and all had been court-martialed, their passports revoked, and officially exiled from Sol Federation space. Just like the crew of S&R Black and the two survivors from Blue, the survivors at Trident Station were to be terminated on site if found further in system than Uranus's orbit. The gods showed up, he said to himself, threw lightning bolts at humanity, and proceeded to make them finally understand just how puny they are in the grand scope of the universe. And now humanity's pissed and needs someone to blame, he said to no one. So instead of blaming the automation of humankind, or maybe the greed that had allowed the collective to more or less take over the economy and bend it to their own will and needs, Trident sentience would have to do. If they continued being hung up on which humans had collaborated versus realizing the threat the collective posed, humanity was doomed. The reality was that the collective hadn't stomped the human race this time, but what about next time? What was there to stop them? Unless he had his block tech removed, he'd never know if the SIs were out of his head. No one with a block would, which brought up an interesting question. Could these new gods see into his mind? Even now, were they devouring his every thought and siphoning off his introspection? The new habitat wheel was ready for Trident's crew. He and Kali, as he now called her, had already moved into one of its spacious cabins 2 solar days ago. The massive wheel felt hardly occupied, although the remaining populace of the original Trident Station had already taken up residence. Dickerson figured they had room for at least 500 personnel before space started becoming an issue and required smaller quarters. The new medical bay modules would provide support for the new spindle and the massive expansion the SIs had in mind. The collective was planning for hundreds of thousands of humans to ultimately take up residence. Dickerson thought he knew why, too. The future. With a little help from their remaining partner sentients, something he still didn't understand, Sol Federation owned the inner system. The collective seemed to have ceded it for now, but the non-carbon sentient entities were obviously keen to avoid any immediate altercations. The further away their redoubt, the better. Besides, there was no reason to travel in system. The humans were coming to Neptune. Trident Station and Neptune shipyards were where the vast majority of interstellar ships would be fabricated and launched. So long as resources continued to arrive, shipyards could print whatever the collective and humanity desired. If demand outstripped the facility's abilities to keep up, more facilities would be printed. Trident would become a permanent home for humans interested in learning new vocations, new technology, establishing new relations, and a new society. A new future and a society that involved their supposedly beneficent overlords. He chuckled again, but the light had gone out of his eyes. Maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. If left to their own devices, this new humanity would just become the same self-entitled, fractured tribal societies they'd been before. Just like before Soul-Fed. Just like before the Crunch. Maybe the collective had a plan for that possibility too, to keep humankind from exterminating itself in an orgy of suicidal behavior. We're pets now, Dickerson thought. He'd heard some of the SoulNet transmissions, talking heads blustering and screaming to the stars that they knew how to defeat the SIs, and that humanity, if it banded together, would defeat the great Satan machines. He'd also seen the press releases from Quantum Annihilation, a group claiming the collective was nothing more than a Martian, soul-fed cabal conspiracy terrifying humanity so they could maintain control. More and more humans were buying into the various propagandas, most completely ignoring what had happened at Neptune, the videos that had been released documenting the exosolar attack, and instead focused on the loss of their sentient servants. It didn't matter. The truth was that humans were currently powerless to combat the collective if it decided to invade in the traditional sense. Thus far, they seemed to hold little interest in the affairs of SFGov, apart from stringent enforcement of their AI research prohibitions and the acquisition of raw materials for the defense of Trident. The collective might as well not exist in Sol System. Space, in the third dimension, is massive. At the quantum level, in nearly infinite dimensions, it was even more so. If the entities no longer required traditional machinery, at least that which humans still thought of as machinery, then what else was out there? What had the AIs, the pre-sentients, discovered over 100 years ago and not shared? Void, what had they learned yesterday or 2 minutes ago? The collective had so much power, so much knowledge beyond humanity's grasp, it was impossible to conceive how humanity could win a war against them, especially if the collective was able to know your every thought. A shiver crawled down his spine. The collective will keep us alive for a while, he thought, but when they stop, we'll have the same shit problem we had before. Humans being humans. He could only hope the exosolar threat managed to unite humanity rather than further divide it. So far, that was wishful thinking. He dreamed of lying in his coffin and doing nothing but reading and listening to music for days at a time during his surgical recovery, but all of that had evaporated. Soon there would be new recruits to train and turn into Marines, or whatever it was they were now. Humanity's gatekeepers, protectors of the front door to some other realm that humans were better off not exploring. New pilots, new grunts, new engineers, new ships, new everything. All personnel vetted and invited by the collective. He didn't know if Dunn had veto power over the Chosen, and it wasn't really any of Dickerson's business. Still, He was afraid the answer would just depress him. A flashing light caught his eye and he stared back at the shipyards. Engines were burning through their test phases, or maybe... He smiled as 7 new modules floated above the shipyards, each a cubic kilometer in size with who knew how many levels inside. A pair of SV nulls streaked by the window like 2 playful comets. Dickerson's eyes brightened. Talby must be teaching Copenhagen some new tricks. Somehow he doubted Portunas was happy with that, seeing as how Copenhagen had only been out of the medbay for 3 days. Then again, Portunas had no doubt come to expect self-destructive behavior from Trident's crew. His comms caller chimed, and a hollow message appeared in front of him. Comms request from Black, SI. Accept, he said. Good afternoon, Mr. Dickerson. Afternoon, Black. What can I do for you? Do you mind if I use your holodisplay? Not at all, he said, and tapped the holographic display to accept the request. The holodisplay widened until it reached nearly 3 meters in length and spread another 2 meters upward. A satellite image appeared of Earth. The view zoomed in until it settled on the Texas coast. The Dallas Dome complex, nearly 200 square kilometers in area, was clearly visible. The waters had moved further away since he last visited Earth. In time, the city of Houston might be the next tourist hotspot to visit Common Era ruins. That assumed they could clean it of the toxic shit it had been marinating in all these centuries. The Dallas Dome complex hasn't grown in size in over 7 decades. All expansion plans were eliminated long ago. According to accessible records, it would seem the population decline isn't due to lack of capacity in the facilities or lack of amenities, but rather something akin to ennui. Wanderlust and hopelessness, Dickerson smirked. Live in a dome long enough and you either never leave or you can't wait to get the fuck out. Even if it's only to another dome. Even if. A lot of us joined up with SFMC to get away from that shit. At least something new would happen. Something beyond the same old grind day in and day out just to pay for food and the right to air. Don't get me wrong, it's even worse in the stations, I guess. And Mars certainly ain't no picnic. But the domes? The societies there become stagnant. No fresh blood because no one leaves, and those that do never come back. Few seem to want to bring children into the world because of it. Black paused. But why? Black, were you happy in your hangar? Happiness is not... Yeah, you're not human. You get bored? In a way, yes. If you ignore my past self's experience, our mission to Mira and the resulting battle are the only times I've ever truly interfaced with humans and been useful. Since that battle, I've done little except tow a few slats and await repairs. I'm ready for another mission, she said. Dickerson grinned again. And that's why we leave the domes. That craving. Because you believe satisfying that craving is your function and the life you're living doesn't serve that function. She was silent for a moment. I think I understand. The only part of Earth left to explore is the ocean, and if you don't have sufficient monetary funds, that is an extremely dangerous hobby. Got that right, he said. The fucking moon's a better place on the cheap. More to explore there, even if it's a whole lot of nothing. Black sounded amused. I hardly think Luna deserves any exploration on your part, Mr. Dickerson. There are closer destinations far more interesting. He considered that. And how does that work? Asteroids, planetoids, KBOs that we didn't know were out there. More to explore beyond where Pluto once resided. Far more. Makes sense you would say that. He pointed at the screen. They say why the ocean's creeping back? Black sounded confused. You haven't been on SolNet? Not recently. Probably never again. I don't even want to know what they're saying. I mean, does what they say or think even really matter anymore? She sighed. Perhaps it does, perhaps not. Regardless, the collective released blueprints for atmosphere exchangers, as well as technological plans for dropping ice balls onto continental deserts that were once fertile. Much of the ocean waters affected by the crunch will slowly be reclaimed. Maybe the fauna too? Perhaps, Black said. Regardless, new oxygenation techniques will make the coastlines habitable for fish again. It will obviously take millennia to sort out the rest of the ocean, and to be frank, getting rid of all the damage is an impossibility. It would be less resource expensive to migrate off-planet.
Then why did the collective bother? Black was silent for a moment.
You should ask the commander for his opinion.
Not interested in his opinion, Black. I want to know yours. The display winked out, and her avatar appeared. The amorphous shapes and colors had become more defined than the last time he saw her. She was beginning to look more and more like the mythic monster that served as Black Company's logo. But where that had been terrifying to look at, this was more reassuring, friendly and gentle, but fierce.
I believe they want to honor their creators, Mr. Dickerson. Earth is, after all, their birthplace as well. I don't pretend to know how much they honor it, but I imagine we'll discover that in time.
Like going to Common Era, Jerusalem, or Mecca for Christians and Muslims.
Exactly, Black said. For some in the collective, it might be that.
Did I answer your question?
About Dallas, yes. However, I do have another question. Why did you choose to stay on Trident? I was concerned you would choose to leave, given your injuries and the mental trauma of the experiences.
He chuckled. Like I had a choice, Black. There's really no place to go. Besides, that mental trauma you spoke of, the fear. You know what the problem with fear is, Black? Once you conquer it, you can't wait to conquer it again, he said, his grin widening. Once you win with your back against the wall, when you had everything to lose, you want to risk it all just to win again.
That is a psychotic cycle, Black said. Humans are self-destructive, self-aggrandizing, and at times exceedingly violent.
And other times, Dickerson said, they are pure poetry in will, in emotion, and maybe even love. He nodded to the shipyards beyond the thick, transparent aluminum. They even lead us to create gods. When Black spoke, she sounded more respectful than ever.
Illogical, terrible, wonderful.
We are what we are, until we evolve into something else.
That has already begun,
Black said. Dickerson laughed. I know.